The message did not ask for attention. It did not need to. It arrived on every human frequency at once: military channels, civilian broadcasts, the quiet diplomatic lines that had carried nothing more dangerous than trade proposals for the last 2 decades. It cut through all of it at the same moment, at the same volume, in a voice so deep and so deliberately unhurried that it felt less like a transmission and more like the sound of something enormous deciding to sit down. You have 30 cycles to surrender. Your colony worlds will be absorbed into the Varakai sovereignty. Your armed forces will be disbanded. Your populations will be registered under the authority of the High Throne. This is not an offer. It is a timetable. The voice belonged to Gar Sovul, Supreme Sovereign of the Varakai, a title that had been accurate for 90 years and catastrophic for every species that had heard it firsthand. The Varakai sovereignty controlled 46 star systems. They had reduced 11 civilizations to client states in the past century, not through chaos, but through something more suffocating than chaos: absolute, patient certainty. They did not fight for conquest in the way that implied desperation. They scheduled it, they announced it, and then, like weather that had already decided what it intended to do, they arrived. The transmission ended on the floor of the Galactic Conclave Assembly, where 312 delegates from 38 species had been in the middle of a tariff dispute that now seemed very small. The chamber fell into a silence so complete that the ventilation system became audible. 11 species in that room had received a message exactly like that one. None of them were free anymore. At the human delegation table, a woman named Sarah Davin sat with her hands folded on the surface in front of her and her eyes fixed on the empty display where the transmission had played. She was 61 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and the measured stillness of someone who had long since stopped moving, unless she meant it. She had served 22 years as a naval commander before transitioning to the conclave. She had been in rooms where things went badly before. She did not look afraid. She looked, if anything, like someone who had just checked something off a list. Her attaché, a young analyst named Paul Renner, leaned toward her with the careful urgency of someone trying not to seem panicked in a room full of people who were. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "do we issue a response?" Sarah did not look at him. She was already reaching for her personal comm unit. "Yes," she said. "Tell them the Terran Union declines." Paul stared at her. Just that? That's the complete message. Across the chamber floor, the Varakai envoy, a towering creature named Velach Dunn, 7 feet of plated gray muscle, dressed in ceremonial armor, turned to observe the human table. He had expected a request for negotiation. He had expected tears, or, at minimum, the particular kind of political stalling that small powers attempted when they were not yet ready to admit the obvious. What he saw was a woman already standing, already buttoning her jacket, already walking toward the exit with the unhurried purpose of someone who had somewhere to be. He filed a report to the Sovereign's War Chamber that evening. In it, he described humanity's response as naive, possibly ceremonial defiance, the kind that small species sometimes performed for their own populations before the inevitable. He recommended proceeding on schedule. He was partly right about the ceremony. He was entirely wrong about everything else.
Sarah Davin's shuttle broke atmosphere from the conclave station 40 minutes after the transmission. She did not speak to the press pool waiting at the docking bay. She did not hold a recorded statement. She boarded, sealed the hatch, opened a secured channel on a frequency that had never appeared in any public document, and said 7 words. "Signal the meridian. Operation Coldwatch is now active." The confirmation came back in under 12 seconds. Coldwatch confirmed. All stations active. In a sub-level command facility beneath the Terran Union's administrative city on Earth, a man named Admiral Joru Mail set down a ceramic cup of tea, looked at the wall of screens in front of him, and felt not excitement, not relief, something closer to grief that a long wait had finally ended. He was 67 years old. He had spent 16 of those years building something that the public records listed as a joint logistics coordination framework. The people in this room knew what it actually was. He turned to the 12 officers seated behind him. "You all know your assignments. No announcements. Begin." They began. Across the Terran Union, things that had appeared dormant ceased to be dormant. Ships logged as awaiting repair turned out to contain very specific and non-civilian equipment. Personnel who had completed classified rotational training programs over the past 4 years received orders that required no explanation and no questions. None of this was visible from outside the Union. That had been the design from the start. Velach Dunn filed a second report 3 days later, noting that human diplomatic channels had gone quiet and their military had not mobilized any visible response force along the border. He interpreted this as the early stage of capitulation. He recommended the First Fleet begin its crossing on schedule. The Varakai fleet crossed the border marker 11 days later, 43 warships moving in the clean, practiced formation of an empire that had done this many times and never found a reason to hurry. They expected a defensive line. They expected a human fleet anchored at a strategic point, outnumbered but present, a show of resistance before the real conversation began. What they found was open space, no ships, no signal, no sign that anyone had been there at all.
The Varakai fleet commander, a veteran named Soru Vel, sent a scan report back to the war chamber. He used a single word to describe the border region: empty. He assumed it was fear that had moved the humans back. He was wrong about that, too. He moved his fleet deeper into Terran space, and the silence moved with him, and the stars gave nothing away. What patience looks like from the outside. On a troop transport running dark between star systems, Staff Sergeant Tamis Orel received a message with no greeting, no explanation, and no context beyond 4 words. 4 days early, you know. She folded the message, tucked it into her uniform pocket, and went to brief her unit. They asked no questions. They had been training for this specific assignment for 14 months, and training had a way of answering questions before they could be asked. The Varakai Advance Fleet reached Vithara Station on the 8th day of its crossing. The orbital grid fell in under 2 hours. It had not been designed to stop a force this size, only to delay it long enough. The landing transport descended in the gray morning light, touching down in the fields north of the colony's central settlement with the relaxed confidence of troops who had rehearsed this kind of operation on 11 other worlds. The outer streets were quiet. The Second Avenue was quiet. By the third intersection, the unit commander,
a Verakai officer named Thalek ordered a full thermal sweep of the surrounding structures. The results showed him that every building within 400 meters was occupied, densely, hundreds of heat signatures per structure, none of them moving toward the exits. They were not hiding, they were waiting. The first device detonated under the road surface at 0530 hours. It was not large, it did not need to be. It upended 2 armored Verakai transports and blocked the primary route into the settlement in a single motion. Within 30 seconds, every adjacent intersection was sealed, vehicles repositioned by remote, heavy debris dropped from 3 rooftops with timing so precise it suggested rehearsal, because it was rehearsal. Then the doors opened. The Thara station had not evacuated because its people had decided they were not leaving. They were farmers and medical workers and secondary school instructors and 23-year-olds who'd grown up knowing the name Coldwatch in the way children know words they're not supposed to know. Heard through doors, picked up in fragments, understood without being told. They were not wearing uniforms, they were wearing their own clothes, and they had made their own choices, and they intended to make the Verakai pay for every meter of their home in the only currency that mattered. Thomas Orell was not in Vithara station that first morning. She was watching a tactical feed from her transport, the kind of small screen that showed unit positions and signal intercepts and gave no color to the weight of what was happening. She watched every hour of it across the days that followed, and she did not look away, and she did not say much, and the soldiers in her unit understood from her silence that something significant was being shown to them. The Verakai had expected Vithara station to be fully occupied within 3 days. It took 19. They never fully held it.
They never fully held it. In space, the situation was equally disorienting for the Verakai fleet commanders. The Terran Navy did not form a battle line. It did not mass at a strategic choke point and defend it. Instead, small, fast units, sometimes 2 ships, sometimes 4, appeared without warning at the edges of Verakai supply convoys, struck with a precision that suggested they had known the convoy's exact route in advance and vanished before escort vessels could generate a response. The Verakai lost 19 supply vessels in the first 5 days. Then a fuel relay near the border, then a deep-range communications array at the outer edge of their patrol corridor. The fleet commanders had no prior language for this kind of fighting. In 90 years of expansion, every species they had encountered had defended something, a planet, a formation, a line. Defense implied an anchor. An anchor implied a place to push against. The Verakai were very good at pushing. The Terran forces were not defending anything. They were present everywhere and fixed nowhere, and every time a Verakai formation moved to confront one group of ships, another appeared behind them, and the supply lines grew shorter, and the fuel calculations grew tighter, and the fleet commanders began writing reports to the war chamber in language that was careful and professional, and, underneath both qualities, increasingly uncertain. One captain, a decorated veteran named Sorath, sent a private message to Gar Sovul's senior military advisors. It contained an observation that none of the other commanders had wanted to be the first to make. He wrote,
They are not attempting to survive this engagement. They are attempting to make this engagement expensive enough that we recalculate its value. I do not believe we currently have the logistical capacity to outlast this approach." The message was received. No formal response was sent. Back in the command facility beneath Earth, Joru Mail watched the fleet positions on the screen and said nothing for a long time. His chief strategic analyst, a 36-year-old woman named Dace Holland, who had written her graduate thesis on Varakai military doctrine and subsequently spent 6 years making sure Coldwatch had an answer for every paragraph of it, stood beside him with a data slate she had not looked at in the last hour. She said, "They're accelerating the eastern column." He said, "I see it. Does it change our sequencing?" He studied the screen for another moment. "Tell Orel to compress by 4 days." Dace was already reaching for her comm unit before he finished the sentence. One of the Terran frigate captains, a man named Becca Seuss, had taken his ship on a wide, slow arc around the back of the Varakai main formation over the course of 40 hours, running so cold and quiet that 3 separate enemy scans had returned nothing. When he finally accelerated, he was already inside their formation's blind corridor, driving directly at the largest Varakai warship in the column. The impact struck the dreadnought along its port engine housing. The explosion was visible on sensors from 4 adjacent ships. Seuss and 9 crew members reached an escape capsule. Before the hatch sealed, he opened a broad transmission on the frequency that every human ship, station, and colony kept open for exactly this kind of moment. His voice was perfectly calm. "The Thara station is still ours." Those 4 words moved through every human communication node within the hour. They appeared on screens in hospital waiting rooms, and on personal devices, and on the big public displays in city centers, where people had been gathering around the news feeds since the first day of the crossing. No one had to explain what they meant. Everyone already knew. In the Varakai war chamber, Gar Sovul received the battle summaries and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that something was not proceeding as intended. Not fear. He was old enough and certain enough that fear had become a theoretical concept, but something adjacent to it. A sense that the ground beneath his assumptions had moved without asking his permission. He made a decision. He ordered the orbital bombardment of a colony called Sable Reach. Sable Reach was not a military installation. It had no weapons grid worth naming. It had a university, 4 hospitals, an agricultural network that fed 900,000 people, and a civilian population of just over 3 million who had come to the edge of Terran space looking for quiet lives and had found them. When the Varakai fleet positioned above it, the colony's administrators broadcast a signal on the standard identification frequency. Non-military settlement, civilian population, no active defense. The fleet acknowledged the signal. Then it fired. The footage reached Earth 6 hours and 22 minutes later. The Terran War Council had been in continuous session for 11 days. The room did not react to the footage the way a room reacts to a shock. These were people who had been tracking every hour of the engagement and who had not slept a full night since it began. What settled over the room when the footage played was not surprise. It was something more deliberate than surprise. It was the sound of a room full of people arriving, all at once and without discussion, at the same decision. Admiral Joru Mail watched the footage until it ended. Then he looked across the table at Sarah Davin, who had returned to Earth 2 days earlier, and whose face, in this moment, was the stillest thing in the room. "They want us to ask for terms," she said. No one replied. "They are waiting for a peace transmission. They believe this is what breaks us." She stood. Her chair made no sound. "We are not going to send one." The vote that followed was not about retaliation in the conventional sense. It was not about striking Verakai border worlds or matching their bombardment with bombardment of their own. It was about something much more specific, much more patient, and, in the way the rest of the galaxy would only come to understand later, much more permanent. The vote was to make Gar Sovul himself the sole remaining objective of the war. Not his fleet, not his capital infrastructure, not his chain of command. Him.
The map that was always waiting. Operation Coldwatch, which the broader military had understood as a large-scale defensive war plan, now revealed the part of itself that had never been in the briefing documents. For 16 years, a small and carefully compartmentalized team of Terran intelligence officers had been building a file. They called it simply the Meridian Map. It contained the precise location of every Verakai deep relay communications station, the exact patrol rotation schedules for the corridor approaches to the Sovereign's capital world, the structural layout of Gar Sovul's palace, including the internal door sequencing, the guard post positions, and the specific load-bearing properties of its outer wall materials. And one additional piece of information that had taken 4 years of patient, invisible work to obtain. There was a navigational corridor through the heart of Verakai space that had never once been patrolled. Not because the Verakai had overlooked it, because they had calculated, correctly by every precedent available to them, that no enemy vessel would ever be quiet enough, or patient enough, or willing enough to use it. Dace Holland stood at the front of the War Council chamber and walked every council member through it. She was 36 years old. She had spent 6 of those years making this specific presentation ready for this specific room. Her voice carried the quality of someone who had rehearsed every word, not to sound rehearsed. "We do not need to win this war the way they expect us to fight it," she said. "We never did." A senior council member asked the question that was present in every mind in the room. Can we actually reach the palace? Dace looked at the corridor on the map. She looked at the palace schematic beside it. She looked at the council. "We have 1,400 personnel selected and pre-staged for the attempt. We have a ship capable of making the corridor crossing in 20 days without generating a detectable signature. We have rehearsed every guard position in that building in a full-scale replica facility in the Terran Northern Territories. We have been operationally ready for this moment for 2 years. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the room had held before. It was the silence of people understanding that the plan they were being asked to approve had not been assembled in response to this crisis. It had been assembled in anticipation of it. It had been waiting, fully built in the dark, for exactly the moment the Verakai gave them a reason to use it. The vote was unanimous. The ship was called the Unbroken.
It carried no heavy weapons systems. Its hull had been treated with a composite that scattered active sensor returns in 4 directions simultaneously, making it appear to any Verrokai long-range detection array like low-density field debris. It had been built to sustain a specific velocity that kept its thermal output below the detection threshold of Verrokai deep scan technology. 1,400 soldiers were distributed across its lower 4 decks for 20 days. They slept in 4-hour rotations. They trained in the corridors. They ate cold rations and spoke in low voices and watched the countdown display mounted at the end of each deck section. Tamas Oral received her new orders on the same day her unit was pulled out of the Vithara Station Theater. They were given new equipment. They were given a new briefing. And for the first time, the full shape of what they were being asked to do was placed in front of them without redaction. She sat with her unit in the cargo hold afterward and let the silence settle. A young soldier named Cassie Yun, 23 years old, 8 months of active service, sharp and quiet in the way that people are when they have decided to pay attention to everything, said into that silence, "We're actually going to do this." It was not a question.
It was not a question. Tamas looked at her. "Yes," she said. The navigational corridor was narrow and completely lightless. It took the Unbroken within sensor range of 2 Verrokai patrol stations, both of which it passed at minimum thrust with every non-critical system powered down. The crew on the bridge sat in absolute darkness during those passes and did not speak. The ship moved through the corridor the way a held breath moves through a chest, contained, invisible, and finite. On the 20th day, Verrokai Prime appeared on the forward sensor array. The capital world, gold and green from orbit, wrapped in orbital station rings and a fleet of warships moving in the slow, practiced patterns of ships that have never needed to be afraid of anything approaching from outside. They were not going to the fleet. The descent capsules were small enough to register as atmospheric debris on Verrokai ground sensors. 12 of them dropped from the Unbroken's lower bay across a 4-hour window, each on a slightly different approach vector, all converging on a landing zone 4 kilometers from the palace perimeter, in a stretch of low, uninhabited highland terrain. Tamas's capsule struck hard. The restraint harness absorbed it. She was out the hatch before the dust had finished rising, moving toward the tree line while the capsule's thermal destruct system quietly erased it behind her. By the time all 12 units had assembled at the designated rally point, they had been on Verrokai soil for 37 minutes. The palace was visible in the distance, a massive structure of dark stone and high, blue-lit towers, surrounded by walls that had stood for 140 years on the assumption that nothing in the known galaxy would ever be motivated or capable enough to reach them. A soldier named Wen Marsh pulled up the interior schematic on a compact display and offered it to Tamas without a word. She studied it for 30 seconds, then she handed it back. "Same as we trained," she said. "Nothing changes." The outer wall was the problem that had taken the longest to solve in the planning phase. It was under continuous patrol, with a maximum unobserved interval of 85 seconds at the eastern approach. The solution had required 18 months to develop and involved specific tools, precise timing, and 12 people crossing 40 meters of open ground in complete silence. They crossed it. What followed inside the palace walls was not fast, and it was not clean, but it was exact.
The guard positions were where the map had placed them. The door sequences were as the intelligence had confirmed. The team moved from corridor to corridor, level to level, in a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of absolute focus. Tamus lost 3 people in the inner wing, not to a triggered alarm. A guard rotation had shifted its timing by 6 minutes, the kind of variance that could not be predicted from intelligence gathered 18 months prior. She did not stop. She had told her unit, and believed it entirely, that stopping was the one thing that could not be permitted. They reached the throne chamber on the 3rd level. The door was 3 meters high, constructed from a material that had defeated every conventional cutting approach in testing. A specialist on the team, a quiet, exact woman named Lori Sen, had spent 16 months developing a solution that was not conventional. She had tested it 61 times in a replica chamber built underground in the Terran Northern Highlands. She had never missed her window. She did not miss it now. The door opened. The room beyond was large and lit in deep blue, and at its far end, behind a raised platform of carved stone, stood Gar Sovul. He was enormous, over 3 meters tall, scaled in dark gray, with eyes that gathered the blue light and held it. He wore no armor. He had not anticipated needing it. He was the most powerful individual in 46 star systems for 90 years. Nothing had ever come for him before. Nothing had ever been able to. He looked at the soldiers in his doorway and spoke in translated Terran, his voice carrying the particular cadence of a creature that had never once spoken with urgency. "You understand what you are doing." It was not a question. Tamus stepped forward. "We know exactly who you are," she said. "That's why we came." Gar Sovul studied her for a long moment. He looked at the soldiers positioned in the careful, overlapping pattern across the chamber entrance. He looked at the specific placements. He had lived long enough and fought enough wars to recognize in that arrangement a team that had mapped every response available to him and prepared an answer for each one. There was no move he could make that they had not already anticipated. He had made one error, a single foundational error, buried under 90 years of successful conquest. He had assumed that humanity, like every species he had ever faced, operated within the natural limits of what a civilization would actually do. He had not accounted for what a people will do when they have been given 16 years to prepare, and a reason big enough to justify every hour of it. Humanity had not carried limits into this room. The restraints were placed on his wrists without ceremony. Tamus opened the secure channel. "Meridian is complete."
"Meridian is complete," she said. On the bridge of the Unbroken, the pilot, a composed woman named Ravel, closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and began the extraction sequence. The transmission reached the known galaxy within 6 hours. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration. It was a video feed broadcast on an open frequency from the colony world of Vethara Station, the same settlement the Varakai had spent 19 days trying to take 3 weeks prior. It showed one thing: Gar Sovul, supreme sovereign of the Varakai sovereignty, ruler of 46 star systems, walking in restraints through the streets of a human colony he had tried to absorb. He was alive. He was physically unharmed. He was walking under an open sky, surrounded by Terran soldiers, on a street that bore the visible marks of the fighting. Some buildings partially open to the sky, some walls still showing damage, some sections rebuilt overnight by residents who had wanted the street to look like itself for this moment. The people of Vithara Station lined that street in silence, not in anger, not in celebration, in silence. They watched him pass, farmers and teachers and medical workers and young people and older ones who had defended their homes without rank insignia, who had made the Varakai pay for every meter of ground they had tried to claim. They watched with the steady, serious expressions of people who had done something very difficult and had not yet decided what it meant. Walking beside Gar Sovul, one step back and to his left, was Ambassador Sarah Devon. She did not look at the cameras. She did not look at the crowd. She looked forward, her hands still, her pace steady and deliberate, and her expression communicated, without a single word, "This is what it costs to come for us." The transmission played in the Galactic Conclave Assembly Chamber, where 38 species watched without speaking. It played on Varakai warships still positioned in Terran space, where commanders sat very still for a long time after it ended. It played across the colony worlds of the Terran Union, where people gathered around screens and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, something for which no clean word in any human language quite fit. On a medical transport returning from Varakai Prime, Tamis Oral watched it on a small screen in the recovery bay, her right arm wrapped from wrist to shoulder in medical dressing. She watched it from beginning to end without moving. When it finished, she nodded once, small, slow, and looked up at the ceiling. Cassie Yoon was in the bunk across from her, watching the same feed. She asked quietly, "Did we know it was going to look like that?" Tamis was quiet for a moment. "Someone did," she said. The terms were already written. The Varakai sovereignty submitted a formal request for ceasefire negotiations 71 hours after the broadcast. It was long and carefully worded, composed in the Varakai diplomatic register, a formal style that communicated precision and seriousness and, underneath both, the particular kind of gravity that emerges when a civilization is asking for something it has never once had to ask for before. It used a specific traditional phrase at its close, a phrase that translated roughly as, "We invite the exchange of terms," a phrase that in 90 years of Varakai expansion had been received only by species addressing an empire that had just beaten them. It had never before been directed at a species as young as humanity. Sarah Devon received the message in a small conference room at the Conclave Station. She read it twice. She set it down. She wrote a reply and sent it before her assistant had finished refilling her coffee.
The reply said that the Terran Union would accept. She did not celebrate. She did not sleep that night either, though for different reasons than the past 2 weeks. There was still work to do. There was, in her view, always still work to do. The peace terms had not been written by the War Council. They had not been written by the military command or the diplomatic corps or any of the bodies that formal interstellar protocol would have designated for the task. They had been written by the families of Sable Reach, the surviving ones, the ones who had lost people in the bombardment of a colony that had identified itself as civilian and been fired upon anyway. They had been assembled with the help of a Terran legal team over the course of 11 days, in a process that was quiet and deliberate and looked from the outside like grief work, which it was also not. The negotiations lasted 4 days. The Varakai representative, a senior diplomat named Galactic, 20 years of interstellar law, careful and intelligent, and visibly operating under instructions to agree to whatever was placed before him, sat across the table from Sarah Davin and did not waste his considerable skills on positions that were not going to move. He was professional enough to recognize when a document had been finalized before he arrived. On the final day, before the agreement was to be signed, he asked one question. What does the Terran Union require in exchange for the return of the Sovereign? Sarah reached into the folder in front of her. She removed a single document and placed it on the table between them. Galactic looked down at it. It was the original ultimatum, the transmission that Gar Sovul had broadcast across every open frequency 39 days earlier, the document that had announced the end of human independence, the dissolution of the Terran fleet, the registration of humanity's population under the authority of the High Throne. The document that had played in every room and on every screen and in every moment of quiet that human beings had experienced in the weeks since. Across the bottom of it, in plain text, was a single word. Declined. Galactic looked at the document for a long time. He did not speak. He did not look up. Then he picked up the signing pen.
He did not put it down until the agreement was complete. Gar Sovul was returned to Varakai space within 48 hours of the signing. He was transported without incident, in the same careful, non-ceremonial way that everything connected to Coldwatch had been executed. There were no photographs released. There was no staged moment of handover. The Terran Union did not need the image. They already had the one that mattered. In the months that followed, the Galactic Conclave received 14 separate diplomatic contact requests from species that had not communicated directly with humanity in years. Some were formal and careful. Some were warmer than expected. Several came from civilizations that had been watching the Varakai for a long time and had been waiting, with the patience of the small and cautious, to see whether anyone was ever going to do anything about it. Admiral Joru Mail retired 5 months after the war ended. He released a written statement of 4 paragraphs. The first thanked his staff by name, or as many as he was permitted to name. The second acknowledged the people of Sable Reach by colony name and by the specific number of lives lost, without euphemism. The third noted that Coldwatch had been built on the work of hundreds of individuals whose contributions would remain permanently classified. The fourth paragraph was one sentence. I hope we never have to do this again, but we are not going to stop being ready. Dace Holland was appointed director of the newly established Terran Strategic Intelligence Division 6 weeks after the ceasefire. Her first address to her division staff was brief. It contained no threat assessments. It contained no operational timelines or projections for future engagements. It contained one sentence. We never stopped watching, she said, and we never stopped preparing. Cassie Yoon received her discharge medical clearance 11 weeks after the extraction from Varakai Prime. She had been offered a fast-track commission to officer training. She had taken 3 days to think about it before accepting. On the evening before she reported to the academy, she sat on a bench outside the transit terminal on her home station and looked at the stars for a long time without moving. She was 23 years old. She had done something that would be classified for at least 20 years, possibly longer. No one she knew outside of her unit was aware of it.
She was not sure, if she was honest with herself, that she had fully processed it yet. She was not sure that was something you processed. You just carried it forward and kept moving. She picked up her pack, went inside, and went to sleep.
What the stars remember. Thamis Orell received her full medical clearance 14 weeks after the end of the war. The first thing she did was go home. She had grown up on Vithara Station. She had spent her childhood on its streets, her adolescence in its schools, and her 20s defending it in ways that would never appear in any official account she was permitted to read. She walked off the transit platform into the mid-morning light and stood for a moment on the concourse, letting the familiar sounds settle around her. The damage was still visible in places. A scaffolded building face 2 streets over, a section of road with a newer surface that didn't quite match the old. The colony had started rebuilding the day after the Varakai withdrew, the way communities rebuild, steadily, practically, without waiting for permission or ceremony. Some things had been fixed quickly, some things would take longer. Some things would leave marks that were permanent, and the people here understood that, and they were not hiding it. A shopkeeper named Devo, who had run the same supply store on the Central Avenue for 21 years and who had known Thamis since she was 11, came out to the doorway when he saw her passing and stood there for a moment, looking at her. "Were you there? At the end? At the palace?" Thamis looked at the repaired street. She looked at the scaffolding. She looked at the people moving through their mourning. "I was somewhere," she said. Devo nodded slowly, as though that was all the answer he required. "Maybe that's enough," he said. She wasn't sure it was. She wasn't sure it wasn't. She kept walking. The galaxy did not become a peaceful place in the months and years that followed. It never does. The architecture of power doesn't restructure itself because one empire overstepped and was answered. Old grievances continued, new pressures emerged. The 46 systems that the Varakai sovereignty controlled did not simply redistribute themselves into something clean and equitable because the sovereign had walked through human streets in restraints. But something had shifted, not dramatically, not in the language of official conclave records or formal diplomatic correspondence, in something smaller and more durable than that, in the way other species spoke about humanity when they thought humans weren't listening. Not with fear, though there was some of that, not with admiration exactly, though there was some of that too, with something closer to the careful, particular attention that one gives to a neighbor who has demonstrated in a specific and unforgettable way that they understand the long game. The Varakai had arrived with a schedule. They had announced it on every frequency. They had given humanity 30 cycles to accept the end of everything it had built. Humanity said no. One word, in a reply so brief it had seemed to an outside observer like arrogance. It had not been arrogance. It had been the confidence of a species that had been quietly building its answer for 16 years, that had mapped its enemy's palace while its enemy was composing ultimatums, that had trained 1,400 people for a crossing its enemy had never imagined possible, that had prepared for the worst case not with fear, but with the steady, patient, unglamorous work of people who understood that preparation and waiting are not the same thing as surrender. Joru Mail had understood that. He had spent 16 years of his life on it, and he had never once announced it, and he had been right not to.
Sarah Davin had understood that. She had sat in the most important diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy, heard the most powerful voice in 46 systems tell her that her civilization had 30 cycles to cease to exist, and she had replied with a single word and gone to make a phone call. Tamis Orel had understood that. She had crossed enemy space in a dark ship, walked through a palace that had stood for a century and a half, and placed restraints on wrists that had never felt them before. And she had done it not because she was fearless, but because she had prepared until the fear was smaller than the mission. And Cassie Yoon, 23 years old, 8 months in service when the war began, asleep in an academy bunk somewhere on the other side of the Union, had understood it in the way that the young understand things that are being handed to them, not fully, not yet, but with the recognition that it is something worth carrying. The stars did not care. They never do. They were there before the Varakai built their empire, and they would be there long after every record of this war had faded into historical archive. They held no allegiance and offered no commentary, and burned with the same patient indifference whether you were an ascendant empire or a species that just been given 30 cycles to stop existing. But the species that lived beneath them remembered. They remembered what 30 cycles looked like, how it had felt to hear a voice that certain, that enormous, that completely sure of itself, giving a timeline to the end of everything you were. And they remembered what the answer was, one word, sent before the coffee was cold.